Getting, responding to, and applying feedback can be one of the most difficult things you have to do in your academic or professional life. You sometimes work on a project for weeks, months, or even years, and then you send it out and you get it back. That graded paper, that peer review, that work evaluation, and your heart just sinks. Well, in this episode of Learning and Leisure, we're going to talk about why feedback can hurt so much and why that's important. And we're going to talk about ways in which you can respond to feedback and apply it in productive ways, whether it is good feedback or unfair or in bad faith. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a specific, clear tool chest of things for turning critique into growth and a strategy for applying all kinds of feedback to your work and improving not only that project itself, but a skill set that you're going to then take with you for the rest of your life. So let's get started. Hi, I'm Alex Mika, and I'm a PhD student studying English literature. One of the things I'm most interested in is finding tips and strategies for time management that will help you succeed in your professional, educational, and personal life. On this episode, we're talking about feedback, which I love. I really enjoy getting feedback on my projects, especially from people whom I care about and trust. And I think about writing, especially, as a collaborative process. So for me, getting feedback is a really important stage because it allows me to bounce my ideas off of other people, to have conversations about them, and to think about the work in a new light, especially because for a lot of my projects, I don't want them to exist in a vacuum. I want people to see it. I want people to read it. And so I want to hear what people think and if my ideas are actually coming across. So I like to think about getting feedback in terms of two major stages of production. The first one is when it's still in progress. Now, thinking about when to actually get feedback is a really important thing because my rule of thumb is I don't send something out until I realize that I can no longer do any more for it on my own. I will give my best faith effort to complete this thing as much as I can. And even if I feel like there are places where I can't improve it, but I know need improvement, I still send it out. But the main thing to consider is when you feel like you've reached the end and the limits of your own capabilities at this point. Once I've found that I've reached that stage, I create a list of 3 things. The first are the factors that I think are the strongest. Maybe I really think the organization of a paper is especially strong, or maybe I think my argument is really solid at that beginning, and I establish what the argument is and what the scope is and why it matters. Or maybe I really like how I read a certain passage. Identifying those strengths is really important. The second stage is to identify the things that still need improvement. Maybe I know that there's a paragraph in the middle that is not working at all. And I think it's important to include, but I realize that as it works right now, it might derail some other argument. Or maybe there's a story in there that isn't quite working, but I don't know why. So I identify those. And the last category of things is things I'm ambivalent about. I'm just not sure. Maybe I talk about a story and I really like it, but I don't know if it actually adds anything. Or maybe I think there's an analysis of a passage from a book that does important work for my argument, but maybe I feel like I didn't read it totally correctly. I think I'm on the right track, but I'm just not sure. I need a second opinion. So once I've identified the strengths, the weaknesses, and the things that I am not quite sure about, I then create a list of people that I would like to share this piece with. And those go into 2 categories. There are the experts or the kind of authoritative figures that I really respect and admire, who I know a lot more about this topic or about this process than I do. And so I want to get their feedback on this as people who are in the know. And I also sometimes really like to get outside readers as well. These are people who I still value their opinion. I still think that they are intelligent and I want to hear what they say, but they might not have as close of a connection to the issue itself, or they might not know as much about the topic itself, but they can read this piece and they can still provide some really important feedback. Now, to that first group of people who are in the know, I'm going to ask very specific questions. I'm going to say things like, do you think that this quote on page 6 does this thing? So I actually ask for specific feedback. I anticipate the kinds of things that I'm going to want them to talk about, or I anticipate certain problems that I imagine they're going to highlight. And I also ask them generally, like, provide your other ideas too, and anything that comes to mind or that you think would be useful mentioning, but here are some things I'm thinking about, so that this sets up a couple of expectations. One, it shows that I'm thinking about this work very actively. And the second thing is, I am kind of framing what the feedback is going to be focused on, the things that matter most to me. And I'm also leaving the door open for that person to identify things that I might not have thought of. Because remember, this thing is still in progress. To the outside readers, I'm going to ask them more general things, such as, were there any places where you got totally lost? And was that something that I can fix? For example, if they are lost because it's just not a subject that they're particularly interested in, or they don't really know enough about the topic to really follow the argument, or is it something where the language is confusing? Is it something that I did? I ask them to consider those two possibilities. And even that feedback is really helpful, because my goal is for people of a lot of different types of interests to read my pieces and be able to engage with it. Even if it's something outside of their wheelhouse, they should be able to at least generally follow the argument. And so if they find places where they get lost or confused, or parts get maybe boring, that's really helpful information for me. Once I've gotten that feedback from each of those groups, I then compile it together. And we'll talk about what I do at that stage in a moment. But I think one of the first times I did this process was in high school. I'd just written a musical. It was my first time writing something like that. It was a full-length musical, and I knew it wasn't like great, but I was pretty happy with it. I knew that I couldn't go any further with it on my own. So I shared it with my drama teacher at the school, and I'd done a number of plays with him. I had built a really good rapport and trusting relationship with him. He was a great mentor to me. I really appreciate this man so much. He's done so much for me in this process, because I sent him the play, I shared it with him, and I asked him, please, 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 tear it up if it deserves it. Like, really go hard on it. And he did, because he knew I could take it. And that's another really important thing, is to think about when you're asking these people, these authoritative figures and these outside readers, you want to pick people whom you trust and who you know care about you. They might not be as invested in the subject as you are, but they have to be invested in you. And you have to know that they have your best interests at heart. And that makes that process especially, collaborative and welcoming. And so for me, I really like harsh feedback. I like people to get as hard as they possibly can on the thing, because I know it's not personal in that case, because I know they care about me. So I'd much rather that they didn't protect my ego and leave some things in there that could be better. So I tell them, pull the gloves off. And he did. He sat me down after school one day and he said, this play doesn't work, and here's why. And then we went page by page, line by line. And he said, okay, what are you trying to say with this line? What is the message here? Or, this character sounds a lot like this one in this scene. How can you separate them out so that they feel distinct? Or, this scene completely takes things in a whole other direction. You're writing a comedy, but now this feels like a tragedy. How are you going to get people back to laughing? Like, this is just so sudden and shocking. You have some really great jokes in Act 2, but the Act 1 break is really tragic. Like, what are you trying to accomplish with this? And these were really important questions for me. And I really have to say, at the end of that afternoon, I learned more in those few hours than I had about playwriting in all the previous years leading up to it. It was so invaluable to be able to go through those things, to look at each thing detail by detail. And I didn't end up really working on that project for much longer. I think I revised it a few times, and I ended up abandoning it or shelving it. But I still apply so many of the lessons that I learned that day to just about anything I write now. Not just plays, not just musicals, but also poems and short stories and even scholarly essays about Shakespeare. Like, the things that I learned that day could be applied wide. So that's my process for getting feedback in the early stages of development. Once I realize that a project is as good as it can be without any outside help, I identify the strengths of the project, the weaknesses, and the things that I'm not quite sure about. I then find people who I care about and who care about me and whom I trust, and I share the piece with them, and I ask them specific things that frame how they're going to be reading that piece. I also keep it open so that they can provide feedback on things that I might not have even considered. So for people who are authorities on the subject, who I respect, and who know a lot about the subject, I'll ask them very specific questions like, how does this work? Or do you think that this strategy is working on page 7? For people who are more outside readers, who might not have as much knowledge about the subject itself, their valuable feedback is going to be on more general things, such as the overall flow or the language. Are there any places where the writing feels confusing or maybe overly explained or maybe even under-explained? Those kinds of things are going to be incredibly helpful because then we bring it all together. And now it's time to actually respond to that feedback and to think about it and apply it. So the first thing I do is I pause, I stop, I get the feedback, I compile it, I read it, I internalize it, and I don't do anything except thank them for their feedback. And then I wait a little bit. I will go for a walk. I might even take a full day before I start thinking about how I might respond to each of those pieces of feedback. This pause is incredibly important because even with people whom you trust and who care about you, they might say it very nicely, right? But it can still feel personal. And the reason for that is because feedback activates the same part of our brain as social rejection. The amygdala, the part of the brain that responds to threats with either a fight or flight response, that's responsible for developing emotional memories and is central to learning things and creating and making decisions. It's all operating on the same part of the brain. And so it can sometimes mistake critique of your work with critique of the self. And this is where it's really important to make that separation and to realize these people are talking about this one project. Of course, it came from you, but that doesn't mean that it is a reflection of your whole self. And so once you get that feedback, and if you are feeling emotional about it, if you are feeling like it's an attack, take some time. Take some time away from it and really think about, is that a fair response? I always like to wait at least 24 hours. And so once I come to a point where I feel like, okay, I can approach this more objectively. And what usually helps me do that is that collaborative mindset. I'm thinking about it just in terms of the project. I'm thinking about it in terms of skills that I'm trying to develop. And I recognize that by working through this, I can really improve. And that's all I want at the end of the day. So once I've had enough time away from the feedback, I sit down and I make a compilation of all of it. And I break it down piece by piece. And I actually generate a response to each of those pieces of feedback for myself, not for the people, but as a way of thinking through it. So let's say someone says that this paragraph doesn't work for these reasons. I'm going to read that paragraph again. And I'm going to say, okay, do I agree? Do I disagree? Is it somewhere in the middle? What are they really talking about? And I go through it. And as I'm going through all of this feedback, I try to identify patterns. For example, one of the things that I've noticed in my own dissertation, having now completed a number of chapters for it, is I tend to assume that the reader knows more about a certain aspect of the topic more than I should. Because having worked on this really niche thing, I can forget that because I'm pulling from a lot of different fields and a lot of different contexts, I might be, in this specific instance, I might be the only person who's seeing the connection between these things. And so I need to make that connection clear to people who are in pocket A, in pocket B, in pocket C. I need to bring it together into one kind of narrative. And so for me, historical contextualization is something that I really need to work on for this dissertation. I need to build out those kinds of things and explain the cultural significance of certain phenomena. So I recognize that because I noticed in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, I got a very similar comments from one of my readers whom I deeply, deeply respect and admire. And so they said, this needs more contextualization. And I saw that a few times and I realized, oh, this is a skill thing. This is something that doesn't just apply to this chapter, but something I really need to be thinking about whenever I'm writing. And so now as I write new chapters and new sections, I try to think about that and anticipate that feedback and think, oh, this moment that I just talked about, will people in groups A, B, and C be able to understand it? Or do I need to make some connecting bridges? So identifying those kinds of patterns is really, really, really important because that can be something that you need to work on beyond just the scope of this one project. And then, once I've gone through and responded to everything, I try to find what are the most salient points. And I rephrase that feedback into language that I understand or that I might use myself. And I apply it as a comment on a Google Doc or as an inline comment if I've printed out the paper and I'm writing in between the margins or in the margins of it. And so I think about it in my own terms. Okay, what is this person saying in a way that I might think about it? And then I try to apply the things that are most relevant, that still I believe stay true to the project as I see it, and I respectfully leave aside the things that I disagree with, but I have a very good and informed reason for why I'm not going to, maybe change the argument in this way or not bring in this particular source on an issue, right? Whatever it might be, I try to generate a very specific reason for why I'm not doing it. And because at the end of the day, this is your project, right? Of course, compromises are going to need to be made in various cases, such as if you're doing this for a grade, you may not want to necessarily jeopardize your grade just because you disagree with the professor. Of course, if it's something that you really strongly believe in, and it's something in which you have an opportunity to respond, maybe have a conversation about it. Because it's still in that developmental stage, you might still be able to say, well, I really appreciate your feedback on this. I was wondering if you could please tell me a little bit more about this comment. Why do you feel like this doesn't work? Or how might it work better if they have, suggestions for that? And so reframing a lot of that feedback into questions to send back to the person and get deeper answers on can be one way in which you can give another opportunity for another set of feedback and also get better answers on why they responded in the ways that they did. And maybe that'll lead you to change your mind and actually say, you know what, you're right, I should change this. So keep an open mind to that feedback. Even if you disagree, try to think again back to that first step of, is this an emotional reaction or is this a justified and rational response to this feedback? Is this something that I feel is a critique of myself and maybe I'm not quite justified in thinking that way? Or is this a note about the work and something that genuinely can and should be improved? So those are those stages. The first one is to step back and give yourself time to process. Let the amygdala chill out. The second one is to break down that feedback and notice patterns of thinking. And the third one is to take that feedback, rephrase it in your own language, apply the things that you agree with, Gently leave the things aside that might change the nature of the project in a way that no longer feels true to you. And think about the spots that you're still concerned about, or maybe the feedback was vague or so on, that you might want more clarification on to further improve, and send those back as questions. Keep them respectful, keep them gentle, and maintain that attitude of collaboration. These people are, in whatever degree, now collaborators with you. They've seen this thing, they've given you responses, and it's now time to have a deeper conversation about the things that you're still wondering about. And that might determine whether that goes in the agree and change category or disagree and leave aside. One thing to remember as you're getting feedback on a project is that ultimately this is your work. Your name is going to be on it in the end. And it's important to keep the integrity of the project intact. Remember the things that got you into it, that you are passionate about, that you're invested in throughout the process. You're getting feedback from people whom you respect and whose opinion matters to you, but ultimately thinking about what to apply and what to leave aside is really important. Provide feedback on the feedback itself, if only for yourself, and think about, does this comment actually see what I am trying to do? If it doesn't, this might be an opportunity for me to think about how I might better articulate what I am doing and what I'm trying to do, as opposed to changing it to reflect what someone else thinks of the project. So remember what it is you're really trying to accomplish, and maybe ask for those clarifying questions of, well, you read it this way, this is what I intended. Is what I actually intended something that can be done? And if so, how can I get it closer to what I am hoping for from what it currently is? So maintaining the integrity of the project and staying true to yourself and your own vision is really, really important. And it can be something that very easily can be lost, especially when you're getting that feedback from people you respect. Another really important thing that you can do when getting feedback on projects is to keep a feedback journal. Whenever I notice that there's a pattern of observations that a lot of people have, or maybe one person who's seen a lot of things that I've worked on keeps noticing similar things, I go to my feedback journal and I write those things down, because they apply beyond just that one project. This might be a skill that I actually need to work on and really focus on and think about whenever I work on anything. So keeping a feedback journal can be a really great way to not only think about projects in isolation, but to think about those skills that you're working on. What kinds of things do you need to do? I already mentioned in this episode the feedback that I've gotten about historical contextualization when it comes to scholarly articles. Another thing that I know for myself that I've seen in my own writing is that sometimes I might over-explain certain concepts, or I might go way too far and digging too deep into one thing as it stands on its own, but then I might not connect it to the next issue, or I might not transition from one idea to the next particularly smoothly. So I know that these are things that I have to work on, and the reason I know that is because I keep this feedback journal, and I've done the work of noticing those patterns of feedback. I've also looked at my own work and tried to see, is this popping up again? And so then, once I work on something new, I go to the feedback journal, I have my list of sort of writing vices that I have, and I try to avoid them, or I try to anticipate them and think, okay, is this the thing I'm doing again here? Or did I sort of solve this problem? Is this something that I've moved on from and improved from? Now that we've talked about the general steps for how to take and apply feedback, the first being to read it through and then leave it and put it on pause for a little while, then come back to it, read it again, and respond to it, even for yourself, going through piece by piece and looking for patterns. And then finally, that last stage is the decision. Are you going to apply the feedback? Are you going to leave it? Or are you going to ask for further clarification, or maybe get a second opinion on that suggestion? Now, a lot of that last stage is going to be determined by the quality of feedback itself. And so for this, I've decided to do a little exercise where I found an old paper I wrote, in an American literature course in I think my sophomore year of college. And I wrote it on the symbolism of the use of colors in Willa Cather's My Antonia. Really interesting novel. And so I came back to it. I haven't looked at this thing since I got it back that year. So it's been maybe probably 5 or 6 or I think 6 years. So it's been a little while. I'm looking at it with fresh eyes as if I were a reviewer of it. And so I created feedback that I think is fair and should be incorporated. Fair, but a little bit of more thought is necessary. And then a number of types of unfair feedback. For each of these, we're going to look at the piece of feedback that I've given and think through what I might do as the writer to improve that piece. So the first one is fair feedback that I actually would incorporate. It goes something like this. The paper spends a lot of time describing red and blue and Jim's worldview, which is compelling, but it might help to structure these observations more clearly. Right now, the discussion jumps between characters, seasons, and symbolic colors. So, if I'm reading this as me, the writer, I'm noticing, okay, they really like how much I talk about those colors, red and blue, but there are 2 clear issues. It's a structural one, that the organization is kind of off, and there's a number of topics that I am kind of jumping between. So one thing that I might consider is, how might I structure those ideas? Do I go chronologically in the book? Do I maybe go theme by theme? Do I go color by color? Obviously, there's some kind of organizational problem. Now, the reviewer hasn't given me exact suggestions on how to organize it, but they've clearly identified a problem. And so what I would do is I would think about what would be the most intuitive way to progress with the ideas. But clearly, this is something that I should pay attention to and to fix. So that is fair feedback that I actually would incorporate. I agree with this as the writer. Now, fair feedback to qualify, or to really kind of think about what I'm going to take and what I'm going to leave, is something like this. You describe Jim's idealization of Antonia and the land, but it might help to acknowledge counterpoints, like the practical reality of Antonia's work, so your analysis feels less one-sided. In this example, the reviewer is giving me a suggestion in which I bring in something else. I'm acknowledging counterpoints, such as this example of work. Now I need to think, if I incorporate this piece of feedback, will it inherently change the nature of my project? If yes, is that a good or a bad thing? If I feel like it takes it too far in a different direction from what I really want to focus on, then I might signal that, yes, these kinds of counterpoints exist, but I don't know. I think let's focus on this issue, even as important as those might be. I'm going to acknowledge them, but I'm going to say, for the scope of my argument here, I really want to focus on this. This shows readers who might have a similar opinion to that reviewer that you've done your homework. You've anticipated this concern or question, but just because of the nature of the project itself, this might not be something that is worth really pursuing in the level of depth that the reviewer suggested. So in that case, I'm kind of reaching a compromise. I acknowledge that they bring up a really good point, that this is an important issue. But because of the focus or the nature of my project, I'm not going to focus on it as much as I do the things I'm particularly interested in, but I'm going to say that yes, they are important in these ways, but this is why I'm focusing on this. So again, I don't necessarily have to change the whole project just because one person told me to. Now, if they fairly have identified that there's a really big gap, that's something to listen to, but if it doesn't necessarily harm your project to avoid that, you might want to reach that kind of compromise in which you say, this is strong, this is what I'm focusing on, this is something that is also worthwhile, but it's just not exactly the perfect fit. So this is something that I might want to get further clarification from someone on, or I might want to reframe the piece a little bit to think about how I might present my argument, acknowledge that other thing that this person has noticed that probably other people will notice too, but keep the focus on what I actually am trying to argue and make that abundantly clear. So in those two examples, I would say both of the pieces of feedback are fair. They've identified specific things that could be improved in the paper. Some of them might be stylistic, some of them might be truly a flaw of the text that needs to be addressed, as in the case of the organization. And so those are worth really internalizing, and they're productive. I don't use harsh language. I don't attack the writer personally. In this case, I'd be going after myself. But I tried in that feedback to maintain a good, respectful tone. I say what's being done really well, and I say what might strengthen it even further. It's that collaborative mindset. Not all feedback that you receive in your life is going to be like that, especially when you're working outside of your bubble, right? You've up to now been working within a circle of people who care about you and who are going to be hopefully kind and respectful to you. But once the project reaches a stage in which you think that it's done, right? It's now time to present this paper at a conference. It's now time to send this poem to a publisher. It's now time to submit this piece for a grade. All right, now it's out there. And like I mentioned, each reader is going to have their own opinions. They're going to come at it with their own worldviews, their own perspectives, their own experiences, their own idea about what this topic is and how people should talk about it. And so for as many readers as there are going to be that many opinions about your piece. And that's really important to remember at this stage. So sometimes the feedback that you get is going to not particularly be in good faith or fair. And that's why it's really important to go through those three stages, especially that stage of stepping back before responding. Sometimes it might be, you might get a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, you just misread this whole thing completely. But you want to be professional. You want to be respectful. You want to be generous and recognize that the person still has taken the time to read your piece. And so in this last part of this episode, we're going to talk about how to deal with bad or what you see to be unfair feedback. The first thing to do is to separate, again, that work from the person. In this case, right, the work from yourself. And also to separate the reviewer from the review. They might have had a bad day. They might have had a complete different reading of a text. You might be stepping on some toes. They might really have strong opinions about this piece, and they might have written about it, and it might feel like your piece is an attack on them. At the end of the day, you will probably never know, and it doesn't matter, because even the feedback that might feel personal or might feel like it is an attack on you and not just a response to your writing, there's still going to be some really great kernels, hopefully, in that piece. And so it's really important to take a good faith effort to find those kernels in that feedback. So the first thing is separate the emotions of the writing of that review from the content itself. It's a hard thing to do. I get it. That's why you give yourself some space between receiving it and reading it the first time and when you actually sit down to work on the project again. And so try to turn it into something useful. And we'll talk about with each kind of bad faith feedback that you might get, how you might do that. But really do try to make the most use of it. You've gotten this review at this point, you might as well try, right? And then finally, if it does feel just ultimately personal and dismissive, let it go. Don't waste your time on it. Get someone else's opinion. Get a second opinion. Maybe go back to the people who you care about and whom you trust and work through that feedback together and say, hey, I can't tell if this is about me or about them or the thing I'm writing. Can you help me through this? What does it look like to you? And go through those steps, maybe together, and see what's worth your time and your emotions and your energy and what isn't. And still try to find those useful little kernels. In my experience, bad feedback falls into one of 5 categories. It's either unclear, harsh, irrelevant, misinformed, or dismissive. And we're going to go through each of these one by one. So going back to that My Antonia paper example, I went through it and I tried to be as mean to sophomore year me as I could have been to create these types of feedback that you might receive and how you might respond to it as the writer. So the first one is vague feedback. Vague feedback might look like something like this. This section is confusing. Okay? It doesn't say why. It doesn't say what parts of it are confusing, right? It doesn't give you much direction. But even that can be incredibly valuable. So if I got a piece of feedback that said, this section is confusing, I'm going to think about the audience, the context, and the message. So what gaps of understanding might need to be filled for this particular audience? If someone is giving really vague feedback, that also might be an indication that they don't really know what's wrong with it, but clearly there's something that they are not vibing with. And so I will pay particular attention to that spot. I might even ignore the comment itself, but then I'm going to say, okay, this person has identified a problem spot. Let's take a look and see what might be wrong with it and unpack it. So even vague feedback can be really helpful in identifying the spots where there might be problems, even if they're not necessarily going to give you what the problem is or how to fix it. Just identifying the spot itself can be really useful. The second type of bad feedback is something that is harsh, and it might look like something like this. This is trivial, or this section is half-baked, confusing, and reads like a bad stream of consciousness novel. So, okay, this is really where we have to separate the emotional tone of the writing from what's actually being said. And this is why rephrasing feedback might be really helpful in one of those kind of adaptive stages. So I might think about, if they say this is trivial or this isn't important, I might think about, well, it is important to me, so how can I make that reader equally interested, or at least much more interested in it than they seem to be right now? How can I make this more compelling or relevant to that specific audience? So I might literally say something like, this is important because, and then I explain it. So by making it just abundantly clear why I am asking for the reader to give me their time to engage with this thing that they might have thought is trivial or not important, how might I actually make it important to them and really sell it to them? So again, yes, this is trivial, might seem harsh, but it's identifying a place in which the reader has not been sold on what you're trying to argue. So that's really important to pay attention to. In the case of the section being half-baked, confusing, and stream of consciousness, again, that seems like they're really focusing on some kind of level of underdevelopment, or they can't follow the argument. And so what I might think of is maybe they're getting lost. Seeing it as stream of consciousness suggests that there's no clear through line. So I might think of, how might I set up topic sentences that make each paragraph's beginning clear? How might I contextualize a argument or a claim that I'm making? How might I tie it back to the overall argument from the whole piece and consistently explain and make clear what it is I'm trying to accomplish in each section or paragraph or sentence? So even with this kind of feedback, there's still something to pull out of it. The next kind of bad feedback is irrelevant feedback, and that might look like this. You didn't consider the importance of food in the novel. Now remember, in this My Antonia example, I'm writing about the symbolism of colors. Is food relevant for discussion of colors? It might be, but in this particular case, it's not. And this might come from a number of reasons. The reader might be really interested in the subject themselves. They might be an expert on that and feel like they can't really speak to colors that much. So they go back to their wheelhouse and they think about what they care about, what they're interested in. And this is something, when it comes to things like irrelevant feedback, it's really important to consider it, again, in good faith. Consider the gap. If they say, you didn't talk about this thing that is really important, is it important for everyone in this niche, or is it important for that person or a subcategory of that niche? So one thing that you might do when you get irrelevant feedback or feedback that you think is irrelevant, go back to that spot and think about, all right, is this something that I should apply? So once you've considered the gap, think about, would your argument gain something from including this factor, or would it turn the paper into something else entirely? If not, maybe note the scope of your argument. Again, go back to framing. Think about, why am I focusing on the thing that I'm focusing on? And make that abundantly clear to your reader from the start, so that when they read the rest of it, they're not going to be expecting something that they might want to see, but that you're not going to address, which might frustrate them. So if you set the boundaries and the terms of your argument up front, it's going to make it clear, this is what we're talking about. They still might say, hey, you didn't mention food, but at least you've made it clear why you didn't do so at the beginning. The next kind of bad feedback is factually inaccurate feedback. So they might say, you never mention Antonia's work ethic. The paper seems to ignore it entirely. Even though, let's say on page 2 or 3, you did exactly that. The reader might have missed it. They might have skimmed through. They might have not seen through the language that you use that that's exactly what you're talking about. It might have felt clear to you, but it might not be clear to them. So you know that you talked about work ethic, but the reader didn't see it. And that's really important to note. So what you might do for this situation is first fact check the claim. Go back to the paper and see, did I in fact mention this or no? And then if they're wrong, think about this feedback as a reader alert. So maybe the discussion could be even more explicit. Maybe you can use certain words or phrases that are going to be much more difficult for the reader to miss. Because if that reader missed it, maybe someone else will too. So that could be a really good indicator that even though their claim is wrong, the reason that they're wrong might still be helpful for you to identify something that can be improved. Finally, and perhaps the least useful of all these types of bad feedback from which we can still get something out of it, is dismissive feedback. This might be something like this. I didn't find the color symbolism interesting. Pick a topic that actually adds something to conversations about the book. Ooh, that one might cut deep. So if you get something like that, that just totally dismisses a whole part of your argument, or maybe the whole thing, step back and think the following. Maybe you want to add a sentence in the introduction that explains why the color symbolism matters, to include the readers with those different interests. Clearly, this is somebody who is not interested in that subject. How can you make them interested? How can you sell them on that point? Make the stakes and the contributions that you're making to this conversation crystal clear. And this goes for just about any kind of writing you might do that requires something of a reader. Making it clear what the stakes are, what the scope is, and what you're really trying to do here, what contribution you're trying to make, how you're trying to advance a conversation, how you're trying to push this idea forth, where you see maybe there's a gap in people's understanding. How are you trying to fix this problem? All of these things can be incredibly important to establish from the outset, so that when your reader reads the rest of the piece, you've set it up for them that this is important for this reason. Now pay attention. We're going to go through it. Just trust me until we get to the end. And then you can draw your conclusions on whether I've done that successfully or not. But these are the stakes. These are the rules of the game. This is how I'm going to play it. And from there, you can really much more effectively sell your point to your reader. So in a nutshell, when it comes to dealing with bad feedback or feedback that you feel is unfair, there's still so many rich things that you can pull out of it if you separate perhaps the emotions of the tone of the writing itself and what it is saying. If you dig a little bit more deeply, you can find things that are actually going to still be helpful for you. If the feedback is unclear or vague, then you might think about, why couldn't someone even latch on to a specific critique? They've identified a problem, or maybe they've pointed out that there is a problem but not told me what it is. I need to do some investigative work here and see what's going on. If it's harsh, try to separate the tone of the language itself with what it's trying to say. So how can this maybe be more compelling or relevant if they say that something is trivial? If they say that it's all over the place, all right, you're talking about organization. The organization can be more effective. Let's think about how that might work. If it's irrelevant and they create a suggestion saying, well, you should also bring in this or that, or maybe what they're saying is a total misreading of what you are trying to do and kind of pushing it in a different direction. Well, it's important to stay true to the subject that you are talking about and to say, all right, well, that's a cool thing too. This is why I'm focusing on this. So that if someone else reads your piece and has the same idea, you've established very clearly why you didn't pursue that particular thing and why you're focusing on this one. If the comment is misinformed or they just totally misread something, double check it and see if they're in fact correct. If they're wrong, then document that evidence clearly, maybe respond to them if that's something that's appropriate, and focus on clarity, because if they have misread something, that means that you could do a better job of explaining what it is you actually are trying to say so that you can prevent further misreadings from other people. And finally, if the feedback is dismissive or it just completely is outside of the bounds of what you're talking about, then separate ideas of personal taste from universal relevance. Think about, okay, how can I make this interesting? Or how can I actually sell what I am trying to sell to readers, this idea, this product, this solution to a problem? How can I make them see that I'm right? How can I make them see that this is something worth their time to read and engage with? Then check with audience alignment. Maybe you sent this to somebody or a journal, or you presented it at a conference presentation where the audience wasn't really ready for that or interested in that subject. Maybe there's a more appropriate audience for that piece. And finally, you might want to strengthen the framing of it. Again, establishing upfront what the stakes are, what the rules of your game are, and how you're going to be playing out this scenario so that your reader comes in with clear expectations about how this is going to proceed and where they should end up by the end of the piece. And the bottom line is this: all feedback that you receive can be a really great mirror for seeing how different readers are approaching the thing that you have produced. And it is not necessarily going to be that how they suggest you improve something is actually how you should fix it. The identification of the problem is usually the most valuable piece of that. If they have identified something, they've paid attention to it, it's worth paying attention to that too. Even if you end up disagreeing with them, even if you don't end up instituting the kind of change that they might have suggested, knowing what they have noticed is really, really useful because it anticipates how other readers might respond to it as well. You are getting a sense of how someone has engaged with something you have done. And that can be really useful if you frame it correctly. If you separate the emotions from the observations, and if you are willing to look at your own work critically, and if you're willing to look at that feedback critically. Don't accept it all just because this person said it. Think about why they might have said it, how they might see the piece, and how well you think they understood what you were going for. Ultimately, though, this project is yours. This is your work. You are going to have to own it at the end of the day. And so make sure that no matter what feedback you incorporate, no matter which feedback you reject or qualify or ask for second opinions on, that the project stays true to itself and that it stays true for you. With that, I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you have specific strategies for how you've dealt with feedback in the past, please let me know in the comments or reach out on social media. I'm happy to talk about this issue further. Finally, thanks for listening. I will see you all next week.